Good day and welcome to Predators Proclivity, the podcast where we look at data from the season for the NHL Nashville Predators and make comments upon it. I'm your host, Preston Proctor. Today is the, awaited, loathed, is the day that I am going to go through and kind of talk about what I believe is bias in the NHL awarding. I guess it's not necessarily the process, but the results. Now, I'd hoped to be able to do this in one podcast, but it turns out that it's too long. So this is going to be part one. I've spent, quite a bit of time going through the history of the awards and trying to understand and prove if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I believe at the end of the day that I am right. I am not. There were a few things that I discovered that about where the bias lies or where the bias shows itself. I guess it's not really where it lies. Anyway, so I explained or tried to explain in the last podcast when I talked about the history of the NHL about how I came up with the time period that I was going to use. And the time period that I'm using is the 1992-1993, so awards given in 1993 to the 2022-2023 season, which was last year. So this year's awards don't get counted. I will do a follow-up where I take a look at the awards for this year and compare it to what my results were. I just briefly glanced at what the awards were. I know they've been out for a couple of weeks, but if you see the spreadsheets I've been working with, you just trying to get this all figured out. You know, I had the spreadsheets, and then I've got my script. Well, that's I guess every podcast to come up with a script to kind of give me things. I don't adhere to it completely, but it gives me the basis of which I want to say, and that way I don't have to spend so much time looking things up. I try to make sure I get things covered. I don't always, but I got my script put together, and it's 16 pages. So the 93 to 2003 awards is actually 30 award years because in 2005 there was no award. There was no season, so which is why that becomes 30. 30 is also a pretty handy number. You know, I could have gone back, further. I think the 92 season was the end of one of the eras, but that's okay. 30 years is 30 years and revealed quite a bit. Anyway, so let's get to it. Or if we don't get to it, we're never going to get to it. Okay, so as I said, my contention is that there is bias in how the awardees are selected in the NHL. Okay, now if there is bias, what does that look like? All right, that's the question. And then, what should we expect from the NHL when it comes to their awards? And I would expect there to be some level of equity throughout I hate using the term equity, but equity throughout the NHL, especially when it comes to some awards that are, like sportsmanship or, how they conduct themselves on or off the ice. There are so many charitable efforts going on with all of the NHL teams. And we living here in Nashville, we hear about it all the time. All the things going on, what the players do. That there are good people who also play hockey at a high level that play for all the teams. I say that, and I include Vancouver in that. So you know I'm serious. But anyway, so that's what I would expect. And then, if they're using some sort of metric, then use that metric, right? Now, what we do, or what the awards are, there are 5 objective awards. And for those 5 objective awards, you think we could rule out bias. I did find one circumstance with the Jennings Trophy, which is the goals against, where, I guess that was, now that, never mind, that wasn't bias. It did look a little weird to me, but suddenly after I said that on the podcast, I remember that it's the goals against, not goals against average. But anyway, so there are 5 objective awards. Those, the Stanley Cup, the Art Howe, the Jennings, the Presidents, the Maurice Richards, those are objective awards. They're, Stanley Cup, you win the Stanley Cup. The Art Ross, you score the most, you get the most points. The Maurice Richards, the most goals. The Jennings, you've got the lowest goals against. And the President's Cup, the most points, right? So those are objective awards. The rest of them are subjective. There are 14. There's actually 2 more awards that the NHL gives out, but they don't give them to teams, to players. They're giving out their community awards, the Willie O'Reese Community Awards. I thought there was one. I think there was 2 that was given out this year. Not given out to the teams, so I didn't consider those. But there are 14 subjective awards. And there could be, subjective awards, people are making these decisions. And then there are 7 organizations that are involved in these 14 subjective awards. And so what I'll do is I'll go through each of the awards by groupings of who's giving them out. So we've got the club GMs, they give out the Vezina Trophy, best goaltender, basically. The Jim Gregory Award is given out by the GMs, the NHL execs, the print and broadcast media. Then you've got the Mark Messier Award, which is given out by Mark Messier. The NHL has the NHL Foundation Award. Then the NHL Broadcasters Association have one award that they do by themselves, the Jack Adams, I think that's GM of the Year, and 10-2 shared. Jim Gregory and King Clancy. And then the Players Association have one that they do, the Ted Lindsay, and the Professional Hockey Writers Association have 7 that they give out by themselves, and then 2, the Jim Gregory and King Clancy, they contribute to. The King Clancy is the Broadcasters Association and the Professional Hockey Writers Association. And both of those and the execs and the GMs go into the Jim Gregory Award. So one way of looking at this is to take a look at how teams do with regards to the objective awards versus the subjective awards. That's one way of doing it. If they're winning a lot of objective awards, maybe, they'd win a lot of subjective awards. At least, I guess, at the conference level. It comes to the teams, maybe not. But at the conference level, if the East is winning a bunch of one type of award, shouldn't they be winning this, a similar percentage? You can say yes, you can say no, but whatever. Over 30 years, I would expect things to be fairly similar, and I'll to a degree, and I'll get into that as I go on here. But it's not a one-to-one thing. It shouldn't be one-to-one because not all the teams have been around the whole time. And so then, but at a conference level, you would like to think that things would be fairly even. As we start through this, in the overall awarding, the Atlantic Division does have the highest average of years in the time period. Florida is the one team that didn't quite make it. Their first year was the 93-94 season. So of the 30 award years, they were around for 29. The other 7 teams were all there the whole time. They're the only division. They've got all the awards, and not, I guess let's back up a little bit, not all the awards have been awarded for the entire 30 years. Most of them have, but some of them came in later. And I explained the brief history. I kind of went through all of that too, but we'll pick that up as we go. Okay. But the Atlantic is unique in the standpoint that most of its teams have been around for the entire length of this time period. The Metropolitan has 2 teams that are less than 30, Carolina 26 and Columbus at 23, which is pretty good. So the Metropolitan and the Atlantic, most of their teams have been around for the bulk of this 30-year period. You get to the Central, and they have 5 teams less than 30 years old. Arizona is 9. Yes, there is Phoenix before that. As far as I can tell, they don't claim the awards from that time period. And as far as I know, Winnipeg also doesn't from the previous team in Winnipeg. So I try to separate that out. It gives me fits. But anyway, so you got Arizona at 9, Colorado 28, Minnesota 23, Nashville 25. So Colorado, Minnesota, and Nashville, they're close to the 30-year period. Arizona 9 and Winnipeg 12. So comparing how many awards Arizona gets to how many awards Detroit gets is not reasonable because Arizona's only been around for 9 years. Plain and simple over the course of this time period, right? So I had to go through a normalizing process of saying, okay, what would be reasonable? You can't just say, oh, here's the number of awards that Detroit has won and Arizona hasn't won that. Well, Arizona has only been around for 9 years, so that would not make sense. So I did go to the effort of trying to normalize this and make sure I had everything covered. Okay. And then we get to the Pacific. And Pacific has 3 teams that are less than 30 years old. And the 2 newest teams, Seattle at 2 and Vegas at 6. And then Anaheim has been around for 17. So again, you definitely can't compare Seattle to a team like Detroit, although Seattle actually has done pretty well. They've won a subjective award in their 2 years, the Calder, best rookie, which puts them ahead of a lot of teams. Vegas has also won quite a bit. Vegas has won 8 awards total in their 6-year history. So both of those teams are doing pretty good early on. Anyhow, so looking at that part of it, and then normalizing things out. For instance, let me just give you a couple of numbers here. So over the course of the study, 373 awards were available subjectively, 150 objective. 30 years, 150 awards, objective, 373, for a total of 523. 523 awards possible. Normalizing that out, the Eastern Conference, taking what Florida couldn't have won, normalizing that, their maximum number of awards is 509. And then so in the Eastern Conference, and then the Western Conference, 397. So there is a difference there, roughly 77%, right? So overall, the Western Conference has only been eligible for about 3/4 of the trophies that have been awarded over the course of a 30-year span. So you would expect that the East Coast would win more over 30 years than the Eastern Conference would win more than the West. And if it was somewhere around 3/4, it would make sense. It would look fairly equitable, maybe a little weird that it was that close. But what it actually is, it's less than 2/3. The total number of awards won for the East is 323 versus 198 for the Western Conference. So there's just rough numbers here, 300, 200, a little more than 300, slightly less than 200. So 67% versus 77%, which would be, that would make sense. interestingly enough, the Atlantic Division is the only division that has a higher percentage of subjective awards won than objective awards won. And they also have the highest percentage of awards won, which, okay, that would make sense. They have the teams that have been around the longest, 33%. They've won a third of the awards available. The Metropolitan has won 30%, the Central 24%, and the Pacific 25%. But the bulk of those are subjective awards. They have the lowest percentage of, the Central has the lowest, but the Metropolitan has the highest percentage of objective awards that have been won, 34.7%, but they've only won 28.3% of the subjective awards for a total of 30% overall. A little bit of a bending towards the Atlantic Conference. One of the things I did, I said, okay, well, what if what if it was a perfect world? How many awards would they win, and what would be the difference? And the difference is that the Atlantic would win about 24 less awards. The Central would get about 18 more. The Metropolitan actually would win 7 more awards. So they are not, really the Metropolitan Conference has also been skewed, which is one of the things that I found. Okay. Looking at the Atlantic Division. So within the Atlantic Division, which has a higher subjective than objective, there are 6 teams that follow suit. The 2 Florida teams are the 2 teams that are the exceptions, which is interesting. Florida is been around for all but one of the years, but Tampa Bay is a team that has won more objective than subjective awards, which seems weird. Their total win number of awards won is the 3rd highest in the division. Highest is Detroit, and then comes Boston. But Tampa Bay is 3rd, but it's because they win more objective awards. They won 3 Stanley Cup trophies. They got 3 Art Ross trophies, a President's Cup, 3 Maurice Richards. They did get 2 Hart, 3 Conn Smythe, which are subjective awards. So they've got good players. They won 3 Stanley Cups. They got a President's Cup. And yet they only win 19 subjective awards, 10 objective awards, 19 subjective awards, which Buffalo has won 19 subjective awards. They have no Stanley Cups. They only have 3 objective awards, and they are one of the highest. They have the highest differential in percentage between objective and subjective. Interestingly enough, Buffalo, 3.1% difference. They've won 5% of the subjective awards available to them and 2% of objective. So it looks a little, even though Tampa Bay has had a really successful team, they have not been on the radar when it comes to the subjective awards. Interestingly enough, when they did win the Stanley Cup trophy in 2004, they won a total of 7 awards that year, which is the most for a Stanley Cup winner. Detroit has also done that. Interesting to me is that when I look at the number of awards won by the Stanley Cup winner, a lot of times it's like 2. They get the Stanley Cup, they get the Conn Smythe, and that's it. So it doesn't, this year of your Stanley Cup doesn't seem to be a year to win a lot of subjective awards in general. Again, Detroit did 1 year and Tampa Bay did 1 year, but overall, that's not the year you're going to win. I think that's okay. But that's just how it goes. Okay. Again, so Buffalo has the highest percentage gap in the Atlantic. I think primarily from winning seven Vezina trophies, which if you've listened to the show, is the Vezina trophy is the one that kind of bugs me the most because Jonathan Quick never won it. Unlikely to win it at this point, but should have won it. Should have won it at least once. But Buffalo has won it 7 times. But even if you take those 7 Vezina trophies out, they still have a higher subjective than objective percentage. Seattle does have the highest percentage gap. Buffalo is second overall, first in the Atlantic. But Seattle has won 1 subjective and 0, and they've only been in the league for 2 years. Their gap is fairly big, but it's meaningless because how long they've been around. Okay. Detroit does have the highest subjective percentage and the highest overall percentage. Pittsburgh also has the highest overall percentage, not in the Atlantic, but comparatively. But they have 50% more objective trophies than Detroit and one of the highest percentage gaps at 4.9%. They've won 18 objective trophies and 27 subjective trophies. And just to throw another number in here, roughly an easy number to use is there are 2.5. Because if you've been in the league for 30 years, because not all the subjective trophies have been around the whole time, 2.5 times more objective or subjective trophies to objective trophies. So 2.5 times, right? So if you were winning objective trophies at the same rate that you were getting subjective and you had 2 objective trophies, you would have 5 subjective trophies. Pittsburgh has 18 objective trophies and 27 subjective trophies. And then Washington also has a very high percentage gap at 5.8. They've won 15 objective trophies and 16 subjective. 15 objective, 16 subjective. So this is one of the things that was kind of surprising to me. Now we got into this because, I'm looking at Detroit and, what their percentage is of overall trophies won, 8.6%. Okay, so they're the highest. Well, what's next? And what's next is Pittsburgh at 8.6%. But that's because they win so many objective trophies. So I was kind of surprised. I would have thought, Pittsburgh's got Sidney Crosby and Washington's got Ovechkin. And I'm like, wow, those guys are really good players, played for a long time. Apparently not getting the awards that they could have. But the team's not getting the awards. I mean, obviously they've done really well because they've won all the other all these objective awards, but not winning the subjective awards. So 8.6% is the highest percentage of trophies, which is Detroit and Pittsburgh. So as far as this division goes, really, I mean, you can look at Toronto. Okay, Toronto's is higher, but they've won 2 objective and 9 subjective. Ottawa 1 and 9. Montreal 1 and 11. So yeah, Montreal's probably winning a little bit more subjective than they should. But overall, yeah, it's the big winners in the group, the Detroit, Buffalo, and Boston that seem to be the teams that get the awards as opposed to the other teams. In general, I mean, I'd say the Atlantic Division is biased, and that awards are biased towards the Atlantic Division. But those 3 teams do seem to be the teams that are getting the trophies. Again, kind of looking at the teams from the Atlantic. Boston's won 1 Stanley Cup. They got 4 awards that year, the Stanley Cup, Conn Smythe, and 2 others. Buffalo has not gotten a Stanley Cup. Detroit has 4. Okay, Detroit has 4 Stanley Cups during this time period. But, again, it's winning the Stanley Cup and not the years that you're winning the awards. During those 4 years, they won 2, 2, 4, and 7. Stanley Cup and Conn Smythe all 4 times. And the only trophies they won 2 of those years. Montreal has 1 Stanley Cup. Again, all they won that year was 2. And then Tampa Bay, as I covered, got 7 the first year. And then only 2 awards in the other 2 Stanley Cups, which interestingly enough were back-to-back. Again, another circumstance where it seems like, well, if you're going to be giving out awards to the best players and you've got a team that wins back-to-back Stanley Cups, somebody on that team might qualify. Moving on, the Metropolitan Division. This division also has 5 teams with higher subjective than objective. 2 of the teams are the newer teams, Columbus and Carolina. The teams being left out of that group are New Jersey, Pittsburgh, and Washington, who are also the highest award winners overall in this group. New Jersey having 23, not quite the total of 29 that Tampa Bay has, but still 8 objective and 15 subjective. So not quite on par. They've won 5.4% of the objective and 4% of the subjective. So those 5 teams, Carolina, Columbus, New York Islanders, New York Rangers, and Philadelphia Flyers, they do have higher percentage of subjective to objective, but they have totals of 3, 8, 11, 14, and 7 when it comes to the number of awards won. So over the course of 30 years, they're not even winning 1 a year. Like Carolina, that's 11. Apparently my math skills are kind of faded on me on that one, but they've got 11 in their history. Columbus has 8. New York Islanders and the Rangers 11 and 14, and the Flyers 7. 23, 45, 31 for the Devils, Penguins, and Capitals. During this course, New Jersey did win 3 Stanley Cups, as did Pittsburgh, with Washington winning 1. So they've been no slouch, and they've had good teams. Again, primarily all they won during all of those was the Stanley Cup and the Conn Smythe, except that in New Jersey's last Stanley Cup, 2003, they didn't win the Conn Smythe. That J.S. Giguère of the Anaheim Mighty Ducks won the Conn Smythe that year. And that's the only year in this 30-year history where the winning team, the Stanley Cup winning team, did not win the Conn Smythe Trophy. Of course, we know in this year, one of the media's favorites, Connor McDavid, won the Conn Smythe Trophy, even though Florida won. But we've already seen where the media doesn't like Florida. Now that they've won a Stanley Cup, I don't expect that to change. And so, with this division, it just kind of looks like Pittsburgh and Washington are being left out. They're winning a lot of awards, and maybe because they're winning a lot of awards, but that doesn't fly because I don't know, if they've got the best player on the team, they should be winning the awards, right? The Central Division, we have 4 teams with higher subjective to objective, not including the 2 teams with the highest trophy count, Chicago and Colorado. So again, it seems like the more awards you win, except in the Atlantic, the more awards you win, the more objective awards you win, the less subjective awards you win, unless you are in the Atlantic Division. So Colorado is another team which has not quite been around for the entire length of it. They came in 95. They've got 28 years of awards, so it's pretty close. Arizona has 9. But the Central Division teams that have more subjective to objective, the Wild with 7 awards, the Predators with 9 total, the Blues with 17. They have 4 objective to 13 subjective, and then Winnipeg has 4. No objective awards, 4 subjective awards, 12 years of their history. So there you go. It's not like they're winning a lot of awards. St. Louis did have a Stanley Cup in there. Chicago had 3. Colorado had 3, and Dallas had 1. But St. Louis is in the bracket with higher with delta. It's not. It's 2.5 to 3.5. It's not huge. But they did win a Stanley Cup. Again, they only won 3 trophies that year. The teams that on the bottom, we've got the Coyotes with 0. 0 awards won. I do think they won one this year. I think they got one in 2024. So on their way out of town, as you're leaving, headed to Salt Lake City, here's your award. Can't say you didn't get anything. Phoenix did win 5. Phoenix won 5 awards. But Phoenix's history is not claimed, as far as I can tell, by Arizona. So I can't give them credit for those 5. All I can say is Arizona's been around for 9 years, and they've won 0 awards. All right, they won 1 this year, but we're not covering 2024 yet. Chicago and Colorado both won 9 objective awards and then 15 and 18. Chicago has been around for the entire length of the study, so 2.5 times would be more reasonable. They're a little short of that. Okay, so Chicago, Colorado both won 3 Stanley Cups during that time period. They did a decent haul of winning 2-7-4 and 3-5-4, given that typically during the year you win a Stanley Cup, you don't win a lot of other awards. Colorado did manage to win 7 one year, and Dallas won 5. So that's pretty good on this scale. Yeah, again, if any bias, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'd have to say the whole division, but primarily like Chicago, Colorado, and Dallas that have won 7 Stanley Cups, not getting the awards that it seems like they should be, which is kind of surprising to me. I thought Chicago would be a lot higher up in that standing, but I guess not. All right. And then that leads us to the Pacific Division, where there are only 3 teams that have higher subjective to objective, and 2 of those are the newest teams, Seattle and Vegas. Calgary also has a higher subjective to objective. They've won 4 objective and 15 subjective awards. Anaheim, Edmonton, LA, San Jose, and Vancouver are on the short end of the stick. None of those have won more than 19 awards, 18 being the highest. So the highest number of awards actually in this whole division is 19. 19 versus in the Central, it's 27. In the Metropolitan and the Atlantic, it's 45. And the team that wins it, Calgary, has been around for the entire time, but so has Edmonton, LA, San Jose, Vancouver. They've all been around for the entire length of the study. San Jose's only won 9 awards in their entire history. Can't say that hurts me too much. Edmonton has only won 18 during the study. And if it weren't for, I guess, Connor McDavid's 13 awards, Edmonton would be a lot shorter. Now, he's won 6 objective and 7 subjective awards. But yeah, that's Edmonton also kind of being dissed. I guess they won a lot of awards with the Gretzky, and they've won a lot of awards with McDavid. And they won Stanley Cups. But in this study, Gretzky's numbers were not included. But anyway, so during the course of this study, Edmonton really looks like they've been shafted a little bit too. LA did win 2 Stanley Cups during this period. Anaheim won 1 and Vegas won 1. So, yeah, I would just say pretty much, it's hard to say there's bias against or for Seattle or Vegas. They haven't been around long enough. I think the percentage for Vegas is like 2.7 subjective awards to objective because they've only been around for 6 years, and all of the awards have been around for that time period. So, so it's them having a winning 2 objective and 6 subjective is about right, given that there's 5 objective and 14 subjective awards. Wrapping up this part of the podcast, if you're still awake, it's a lot of numbers. It's just kind of prepping, saying where people are at, the teams are at. It does really still look like the Eastern Conference is preferred over the Western Conference. Atlantic is preferred over Metropolitan, and Boston, Buffalo, Detroit are the big winners, and Pittsburgh and Washington being the big losers. So now what I'd like to do is start taking a look at each of the awards and seeing what is happening with each of the awards. Okay, so that's going to wrap up part 1. With part 2, we'll start going through all the different awards. Thanks for listening. I'm Preston Proctor, and you've been listening to Predators Proclivity.